Thanks very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I'd also request the slides to be brought up, please, so that I'm just going to use those as anchors for our conversation. So they're not going to be very heavy to see, but just take you through the journey that we're seeing here at Citi. I'll step back a little bit and talk about the way we are seeing DE&I in financial services, because that's the industry that I belong to before we get into some of the more specific work that we've been doing at Citi in this space. I think as an industry, we are getting to a point with where we have a very progressive outlook towards diversity, equity, as well as inclusion. Um, the great part is that our work conditions are conducive, right? So if you compare us to, let's say, other industries where the work conditions are a lot harder, unlike that, it is a great industry from a conducive work environment perspective to be able to do all of the work that we aspire to do in order to create a very diverse as well as an inclusive workplace. When it comes to women in leadership, I think financial services industry has really been a bit of a torchbearer, and there are so many examples of women CEOs in financial services in India, in banks especially, which I think is really remarkable. Some of our biggest banks, both private as well as multinational, have been led by women in India, and I think that is really noteworthy to see more women at top of the leadership levels. The other trend that I'm seeing in banking and financial services is far more visible advocacy and equity efforts. So, organizations are going out and becoming more vocal about what they advocate in this space and, the nature of efforts they are taking towards creating equitable work environments. And finally, no ecosystem or industry operates in isolation. And, in terms of the manner in which financial services gets impacted, the impact of technology is far reaching. And so very interestingly, we are also starting to see a lot of connectivity to themes around diverse talent in the STEM space, because there is so much work that's getting done in our industry as well, disruption that's coming through because of the impact of technology. So in that way, it's not really looking at diverse talent in financial services alone, but more broadly in the technology space as well. Moving on to, what it looks like at Citi. And before I actually talk a little bit about some of our focus areas and pillars, I'd spend a quick minute on our presence. At Citi in India, we are almost 25,000 employees strong in terms of our presence, and we're present in, all spectrums of banking. We also have a very large setup from a Citi Solution Centers perspective. And so we have very many employees based out of Citi India who work with leaders and managers across the globe. Which means that when we think about diversity, it's not only about the very obvious strands of diversity, but cultural diversity starts to come into play. Mindsets start to come into play. And we look at diversity from a very, very broad lens in that sense of all of the strands that get encompassed from a diversity standpoint. Now, our focus areas, if you will, are distilled into three key core elements. The first is increasing diverse representation. Second is building an inclusive work climate, and third is creating an equitable playing field for the talent that we have. When I look at having diverse representation, what is it that we really mean, right? It is really to say, look at all of the strands of diversity that we have, whether it is gender, whether it is LGBTQ, whether it is, cultural diversity, whether it is people with disabilities, and say, what is your very specific representation at this point? And how do you very, very, in a targeted manner, increase the representation that you have? So that's a huge focus area for us. And for us, we can make a lot of efforts across organizations, but the numbers tell a story. And for us, that's really something that we look at very, very closely. Women in leadership is an incredibly important theme, and how do we have more women at senior levels within the organization? Citi is one of the organizations globally that actually has declared representation goals. And in other geographies, of course, there's ethnicity as well. From an India standpoint, we're very focused on gender representation from an assistant vice president level and above. And so we track this number very, very closely. And I'm very happy to say that, over the last 3 years, we've seen a 12% growth in our representation, and, potentially sort of at the leading end in our industry around the representation of women at leadership levels. And then just having, in order to be able to have more representation and more people in leadership pipelines, you of course need to broaden your talent pool. So when we look at representation, we look not only at who do we have today, but what's the pool that is available out there in the market, and how do we broaden that talent pool? So we take quite a lot of efforts in the space of actually broadening our talent pool. And, for example, return to work programs for women is one of the manners in which we look at it, where, we're very proud to say we have a program where we have close to 200 women with career breaks who join us every year and go through a very structured journey. So the actual representation of diverse talent is a very, very core area to us. The second is, the inclusivity aspect. And I will say that we believe very firmly that the more emphasis you pay on diverse representation, it is equally important, if not more, to step up our efforts to make it an inclusive work environment. Now, there's a much used analogy to say, diversity is like inviting somebody to a party, but inclusivity is making them, enjoy the party, right? Or feel at home when they're there. And so creating the right climate is something that is incredibly critical from our perspective. So we do a massive amount of effort from an awareness and sensitization standpoint, which is to say, efforts like inclusive hiring training programs, respect at work conversations and trainings for individuals. How is it that you help people understand and see each other's point of view, understand what the other person may be going through, build empathy through the eyes of one another? Managers are really, torchbearers of what employees experience on the ground. And for us, the agenda is not limited to a few people in HR or a few leaders in the business. It is really about down to the last manager. How are you building capability for in each individual manager to be able to provide an inclusive experience, to their employees? As you can well imagine, with thousands of managers, that's not easy to do. Having said that, we believe it's an incredibly important part of the agenda in the manner in which we approach our work in inclusivity. And then in that space, making voices heard. What do I mean by that, right? How do you have systemic platforms and forums where people have the ability to come and voice their views and opinions, and to make them count? So our employee networks and resource groups are a great example of how we actually provide them with employees with avenues, not just to voice opinions, but to take action with regard to those, right? So we see some of the best ideas getting sparked through our employee networks, and we have affinity-led networks. So we have an LGBTQ Pride network, we have gender networks, we have special abilities network. And so we see some breakthrough ideas coming bottom up into the organization through these networks, and a very good involvement from employees at all ends. And then from an equitable playing field standpoint, right? And Preeti mentioned this as well in her conversation, to say, how do you level it out, right? Not everybody is the same, and we don't want everybody to be the same. But do you have the right policies and processes and enablers in the organization to create a level playing field? A good example there is equalization of benefits. So, for the LGBTQ, we've equalized all benefits, for same-sex partners, for example. The other good example is to say, when women go on maternity leave, a decade ago, we put a policy in to say your performance rating gets protected when you go off on your maternity leave, so that you don't in some ways lose out in the journey, which is a very, very important life stage. So having the right policies, benefits, and processes, and when I say processes, I'll talk a little more about it later, but a very critical process in the organization is pay equity. Citi is also one of the few organizations that's gone out and published, pay equity data, which really means that we hold ourselves incredibly accountable to the community around how is it that we're paying equally, especially as far as gender goes, and do we have the right ecosystem and processes in place to ensure that year on year we are ensuring there is equity of pay. And then, none of this operates in isolation. It is important to think about it as a community, and the community is not just Citi for us. The community is the broader ecosystem. And so what are we doing to level the playing field from an ecosystem standpoint or the broader community? Now at Citi, then how is it that's a big agenda, as you can well imagine, and how is it that we kind of focus on this and make it come alive? We have certain levers of change, like we call them, and very, very simply put, it is really hiring more, retaining more, and developing and promoting more. So a lot of our efforts are split out in these pillars to say, what are the actions that we're doing in order to hire more talent? What are the actions that we're doing to retain diverse talent, across the organization? And those that we, of course, retain, the developing and the promoting, right? So not just to say, oh, we provide you with access and avenues to develop, but very, very focused manner, watch how how diverse talent grows within the organization. So for us, some of the things that we track very systematically here are performance ratings, for example, saying are performance ratings by gender equitable? Or, when we look at retention, we have a Voice of Employee survey and we get demographic cuts around it by gender, by sexual orientation, if employees are willing to share that information. Um, and so it gives you a lens to say that, look, is a diverse employee feeling equally at home in this organization as, somebody else, right? So a lot of efforts that go in around the retention aspect as well as the promotion and the development. So right from training programs, development programs, mentoring, sponsorship, there is a host of efforts that go in across these pillars to ensure that we have a very sort of systematic approach towards actually increasing representation and ensuring that representation exists across the leadership layers within the organization. I think we come from an industry where numbers are pretty much everything, but metrics and measurement is very important. And so all of these, including the cultural aspects, including the inclusive environment, is underpinned by strong metrics and, measurement around it. So right from executive scorecards around these aspects, it's very, very clear and very, very transparent within the organization around what is the work that we are doing and how are we faring. And I think it's very important for us to understand and to be able to measure the progress that we make. Otherwise, it stays as a very high level dialogue. But how is it that we are actually looking at and assessing the results of what we do? So, these are some of the pillars and the manners in which we are approaching the work that we do. How do we keep it going? Look, that's an important question. The one thing we are very mindful of, and I heard Dr. Sujaya say it as well, is are you having a programmatic approach or is it ingrained in the DNA of the organization? Is it ingrained in the DNA of every individual? The manner in which we sustain our efforts is very importantly, as you can imagine, the right tone from the top. We're right from Jane Fraser, who is the only woman CEO of a global bank, down to the leaders within the organization at a country level, at a regional level. The tone from the top is incredibly clear around our commitment towards diversity, and we are very, very vocal about it. Having a right governance structure is also important because, as you can well imagine, some of these, when you want to translate them from messages to action, how is it going to happen? So we have a very strong governance structure with a huge amount of business involvement, a steering committee at the country level, a diversity council, which by the way is always chaired by a business person, in terms of how are we actually building strong governance around the work that we are doing and ensuring there is business involvement. Managers, like we spoke about earlier, play a very critical role, and so empowering managers. And then how do you harness the bottom up sort of, power of this initiative, which is through our employee networks. So for us, the sustenance is as important. And, we are not keen on saying we launch new initiatives every single year. It's not about doing 50 new things, but saying year on year, are you seeing progress in all of the things that you start to do? And critically examine what does not work. I think that's as important as saying, no, we'll start a new program, but it's about what's working, what's not working, being honest with ourselves, looking at the environment and the industry peers. And then just finally, right, how is it that we even understand the impact, or what's the impact that we're trying to make in this space? I think to me, the impact, there is numbers, there is metrics, there is measurement, but ultimately the impact has to be much broader. And the lens that we look at it as is not just for ourselves, but for the industry. And, like I said, our talent is an intersection of industries. What is the work that we are doing in the space of breaking biases and barriers and fueling aspiration for diverse talent? There are lots of efforts that organizations make in this space. A very good example is Google's I Am Remarkable. Many of you may have experienced it, but it's a beautiful example of how, an organization can create a piece of work and make it available freely across organizations, across industries. And so a lot of the work that we do, for example, we visit, a campus in Pune called Cummins, where we run a program for over 200 women. Now, we don't go out and hire those 200 women at the end of that program. But for us, what we are giving to the community, the aspiration that we are fueling in these women over the span of the 6 odd months where we run the program is more important.